Oh, Madison. Excellent.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the authors and the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. Although the book focuses on the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians, I think that it offers broader insights and raises broader questions on issues concerning relations between ethnic groups in general, the role of violence and memory in national cultures, and the ties between diaspora groups and their homelands. So my remarks will touch upon some of these issues, and I will share with you some of the insights that I took from the book. The book discusses the different histories of Jews and Ukrainians, but it also dwells on the various points of contact and interaction between the groups. And as a result, we get a useful comparative perspective on the experiences of Jews and Ukrainians. This comparison is one of the main themes of the book, but the discussion of Jews and Ukrainians also invites other comparisons. If we compare Jewish-Ukrainian relations to the relationship between Jews and other European nations, for example, Polish-Jewish relations, German-Jewish relations, French-Jewish relations, and so on, one striking difference is that Jews did not live under Ukrainian rule for the most of the 20th century, because, of course, Ukrainian independent nation state did not exist until the end of the century, except, of course, for the short-lived Ukrainian state that was established after the First World War. This meant that, as opposed to other cases in Europe, where Jews lived as an ethnic or religious minority within the German, Polish, or French state, Jews and Ukrainians shared the same status as a stateless minority whose fate was determined by other more powerful forces. The picture that emerges from the book suggests that this shared status had a dual impact on the relations between Jews and Ukrainians. It contributed on the one hand to coexistence, reconciliation, and affinity between the groups, but on the other hand, this relationship was also a source of conflict and animosity. As far as reconciliation is concerned, it seems that the common narrative of Jews and Ukrainians is to a large extent based on the self-perception of both groups as victims of more powerful forces. The central events around which the common theme of victimhood was built are, of course, the Holocaust and the Holodomor, although the Jewish narrative also includes repression under the Soviet regime, and indeed both groups still find common ground in being victims of the Soviet system. The book provides a lot of evidence for this type of connection. For example, the Jewish writer Vasily Grossman, who published a short novel that compared Nazism and Stalinism and created direct parallels between the Holodomor and the Holocaust. Another example is the Jewish-American lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide in 1943 and referred to the Holodomor as genocide, as an example of genocide. On the Ukrainian side, the book reports about the contribution of Ukrainian activists and writers who joined the Jews in Kiev in commemorating the massacre at Babyn Yar. And the book also mentions the efforts to commemorate the Holocaust in Ukraine, especially after 1991. These efforts include public acknowledgement of the participation of ethnic Ukrainians in the killing of Jews, the establishment of monuments, and the production of films and TV programs dealing with the Holocaust in Ukraine. So there seems to be a general conception of Jews and Ukrainians as victims. We learn from the book that Ukrainian writers of the early 20th century, who integrated Jewish themes into their work, saw Jews and Ukrainians as victims of history. It seems that this idea was expressed already before the Holocaust and the Holodomor in the early 20th century, but also in the late 20th century, we have a quote in the book from Ukraine's Minister of Culture, who defined Jews and Ukrainians as, quote, two victims of history and of regimes which oppressed freedom. The alliance of victims, the alliance between victims, existed not only on a theoretical level, there were also actual personal connections between Jews and ethnic Ukrainians that were based on the experience of oppression. One example provided in the book is that in 1981, activists in Israel established the Society of Jewish-Ukrainian Relations, which included former Soviet dissidents, underground Zionists, and prisoners who discovered Ukrainian culture through their fellow Ukrainian nationalist inmates. These encounters, which took place in Soviet correction facilities, contributed to Jewish-Ukrainian understanding, to the forging of relations under a common oppressor. But the relationship with the Soviet Union had not only unifying, but also a divisive effect. One of the sources of animosity between Jews and Ukrainians is the belief held by some Ukrainians that Jews were supporters of communism, and therefore Jews were an integral part of the Soviet repression of Ukrainians. This accusation is one of the central negative stereotypes that the authors mentioned at the beginning of the book. And according to one of the last chapters of the book, this stereotype was also one of the reasons for the barriers that have been erected between Jews and Ukrainians living in the diaspora, especially in Canada and the United States. We know that both Jews and Ukrainians suffered from Soviet policies, not only in the 1930s, but also after the Second World War, where the Russification of the Soviet Union involved the repression of Ukrainian culture and nationalism. And when in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Soviets also launched an anti-Jewish campaign. So we see that while these experiences served as a basis for reconciliation between Jews and Ukrainians, because they created a sort of an alliance between victims, they were also a source of animosity, which was embodied in the Ukrainian narrative about the role of Jews in creating the Soviet system. In any event, the theme of victimization plays an important role in Jewish-Ukrainian relations, and it can be used to foster both reconciliation and animosity. Now, moving from the realm of narrative to history, we do see that despite the fact that both Jews and Ukrainians were minority groups who in many cases suffered from the policies of more powerful forces, the book discusses the various cases in which Jews were subject to violence from ethnic Ukrainians. One of the most significant cases in this context was the anti-Jewish violence in the wake of the First World War. In 1919, about 50,000 Jews were murdered in a series of more than 1,000 pogroms in the territories of the Ukrainian National Republic. This was not a direct Jewish-Ukrainian conflict, as the Jews were attacked as part of the clashes between the government of the Ukrainian National Republic and its enemies, the enemies of the Republic, which included forces loyal to Soviet Russia, to some foreign armies and others. And the book indeed presents a nuanced and complicated account of these events. On the one hand, we learn that most of the pogroms were attributed to troops loosely connected to the Ukrainian government, while a much smaller number of pogroms were committed by other forces, by non-Ukrainian forces. On the other hand, it seems that the troops attacking Jews acted against the orders of the political leadership. And the book also shows that the Jewish population residing in the Ukrainian state in that period, in the post-First World War period, enjoyed extensive civil rights. The Jews enjoyed extensive civil rights under the Ukrainian post-war state. So if indeed the pogroms were committed by ethnic Ukrainian soldiers who acted against the position of the political leadership, it appears that in this case, Ukrainian Jewish alliance or Ukrainian Jewish coexistence was a project that was promoted by political forces from above, but was not rejected by the general population, at least part of the general population, as evidenced by the fact that Ukrainian soldiers attacked Jews despite the official policy of the Ukrainian state. Other parts of the book also suggest that reconciliation between Jews and Ukrainians is more easily promoted in the context of official political frameworks. It seems that the major steps towards reconciliation were achieved after Ukraine became an independent state in 1991, at the time when the Jews, of course, already had their own independent state. The relevant examples in this connection are official diplomatic relations between Israel and Ukraine, economic connections between the two countries, the movement of tourists from Ukraine to Israel and from Israel to Ukraine. The memory of the Holocaust also plays an important role here. As I mentioned earlier, after it gained its independence, Ukraine developed a more open attitude towards Jewish suffering during the Second World War, and it detached itself, Ukraine detached itself from attitudes, from the commemoration practices of the Soviet Union, which tended to play down Jewish suffering during the war. Israel, on its part, recognized the thousands of Ukrainians who helped to save Jews during the Holocaust by declaring these Ukrainians as righteous among the victims through Yad Vashem, Israel's official institute of Holocaust commemoration. So maybe one of the conclusions from the book is that Ukrainian-Jewish relations benefited from the rise of independent nation-states for these two groups. National sovereignty added self-confidence and material means to promote coexistence, while also minimizing the frictions that existed when Ukrainians and Jews lived as minority groups on the same land. And I would like to conclude with, by mentioning one very interesting group that was discussed in the book, ethnic Ukrainians living in Israel, who are mostly spouses of Jews who immigrated to Israel as part of a large immigration from the former Soviet Union during the 1990s. So ethnic Ukrainians, non-Jewish spouses of Jewish spouses who immigrated to Israel. This is an example of very close personal connections between Jews and Ukrainians, not dependent on political institutions. And it is also very interesting because in this group we have ethnic Ukrainians living as a minority within a Jewish state, which is one of the ironies of history that the book reveals. Thank you.